Wyoming Territory, 1873. The dust was a living thing in Redemption Creek. It rose from the single, wide street with every gust of wind, a fine golden powder that coated the unpainted planks of the general store, the saloon, and the sheriff's office with a uniform layer of grit. It swirled like golden phantoms in the alleyways and settled in the deep ruts left by wagon wheels, a constant, silent reminder of the vast, untamed land that pressed in on all sides. This was a place carved out of patience and desperation, a tiny island of human endeavor in an ocean of prairie grass and unforgiving sky. The sun beat down with an intensity that bleached the very color from the landscape, leaving behind a palette of pale ochre, dusty sage, and the distant, hazy purple of the mountains that stood like sleeping giants on the horizon. Caleb Thorne watched the town from the seat of his wagon, the reins held loosely in his calloused hands. He did not consider himself a part of it, not really. He was a visitor, a man who came for salt, flour, and coffee, and left as soon as his business was done. The town was a necessity, a tool, but his life, his world, was miles away, nestled in a valley carved by a river that ran clear and cold. There, the silence was different. It was the silence of pine and stone, not the tense, waiting silence of men gathered in a saloon with whiskey on their breath and guns on their hips. He preferred the honesty of the wilderness. It made no secret of its dangers. He was a man built of the same hard materials as the land itself. At 32, his face was already a map of his life, etched by sun and wind, the lines around his eyes speaking of long hours spent staring into the distance. His shoulders were broad, honed by the labor of running a ranch alone, and he moved with a quiet economy that wasted no energy. His isolation was a fortress he had built brick by painstaking brick over the past 5 years, ever since the world had shattered like glass against stone. He had learned the bitterest of lessons then. That love was a vulnerability, an open door through which loss could stride without warning. Attachments were an anchor that could drown a man in a storm. He had cut himself loose from all of it, and in the emptiness, he had found a kind of peace, a stark and lonely equilibrium. His horse, a sturdy bay named Atlas, shifted in its harness, and the creak of the leather was a familiar, comforting sound. Caleb had finished his business. Sacks of supplies were tied down in the wagon bed behind him. There was nothing left to do but begin the long, slow journey home. He gathered the reins, his knuckles brushing against the worn leather that smelled of dust and horsehide. He had learned to find solace in these small, tangible things: the scent of leather, the warmth of the sun on his back, the solid weight of an axe in his hands. They were real. They were dependable. They did not promise you forever and then vanish in the blink of an eye. It was then that he heard it, a sound that did not belong to this world of wind and creaking wood. It was a low, mournful whistle, carried on the breeze from the east, a metallic cry that sliced through the afternoon quiet. The weekly train. It was an intrusion, a mechanical artery that pumped the lifeblood of the outside world into the territory's remote heart. It brought mail, goods, and worst of all, people. People with their complicated hopes and their inevitable disappointments. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had no use for the train or the world it represented. He had everything he needed, and more importantly, everything he could stand to lose, right here. He urged Atlas forward, intending to be well clear of town before the passengers disembarked, before the predictable chaos of arrival and reunion spilled onto the dusty street. He wanted no part of it. He wanted the scent of pine in the air, the sight of his own valley opening up before him, the four walls of his cabin that asked nothing of him but his presence. He had built a life where he was accountable to no one, where his heart was his own stony property, fenced off and posted with warnings. The train's whistle was the sound of a lock being tested, and a deep, instinctual part of him recoiled from it. He did not look toward the small, weathered depot as he passed, keeping his eyes fixed on the open road ahead, on the promise of his solitude. Eleanora Vance stepped down from the train car, her hand gripping the hot iron railing for support. The sudden, brilliant light was blinding after the dim, smoky interior of the carriage, and the heat was a physical blow. It was a dry, searing heat, utterly different from the damp, clinging warmth of a Boston summer. She blinked, her eyes watering, and took in her new world. It was vast, empty, and the color of dust. A fine grit was already settling on the deep blue fabric of her traveling suit, and she resisted the urge to brush it away, knowing it would be a futile gesture. She clutched the small, beaded reticule in her other hand, the paper-thin letter from Mr. Sterling tucked safely inside, its promises the only anchor she had in this strange and overwhelming place. She was a stark slash of color against the muted landscape. Her suit was impeccably tailored, her honey-blonde hair coiled neatly beneath a modest hat. Those stray tendrils had escaped during the long journey and now clung to her damp neck. She looked and felt like a porcelain doll set down in a blacksmith's shop, fragile, ornamental, and entirely out of place. But beneath the refined exterior, a core of resilient steel had been forged by loss and necessity. After her parents' passing from influenza 2 winters ago, she had discovered that a respectable education and a gentle demeanor were poor currency in a world that had suddenly become cold and practical. The inheritance that should have secured her future had been mismanaged into near non-existence by a distant uncle, leaving her with a choice: a life of genteel poverty as a governess or a seamstress, or a leap of faith into the unknown. Mr. Alistair Sterling's letters had been her salvation. He had written of a prosperous mercantile business in a growing town called Redemption Creek, of his desire for a wife to share his life and build a family, of the clean air and the endless opportunities of the West. His prose was elegant, his sentiments honorable. He had sent a photograph of a handsome, smiling man and the money for her passage. For months, she had clung to his words, weaving them into a tapestry of hope that depicted a future far brighter than any she could have imagined in Boston. Now, she stood on the platform, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, searching the small crowd for the face from the photograph. There were a few rough-looking men in dusty hats, a woman with 2 small children, and the station master, a harried man with a wiry gray beard. But there was no Mr. Sterling. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. Perhaps he had been delayed. Perhaps his business had called him away unexpectedly. She smoothed the front of her jacket, a nervous habit, and held her head high, determined not to show the weary vulnerability she felt creeping over her. She had come this far. She would not falter now. Caleb had not managed to escape as quickly as he had hoped. A loose strap on one of his supply sacks had forced him to pull over just past the livery stable, within sight of the depot. As he cinched the leather tight, he glanced up, his gaze drawn against his will to the woman standing alone on the platform. She was a beacon of civilization in the dusty afternoon, a stark contrast to everything around her. He saw the fine cut of her clothes, the hopeful, searching look on her face, and the way her gloved hands were clasped so tightly together. He saw her loneliness. It was a language he understood better than any other. He watched as the station master, Mr. Abernathy, approached her, his expression a mixture of pity and confusion. Caleb could not hear their words, but he could read the story in the slow, sad shake of Abernathy's head and in the way the woman's shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible deflation, as if the very air had been let out of her. The hope drained from her face, replaced by a dawning horror. Caleb felt an unwelcome and unfamiliar pang of something that might have been sympathy. He turned away, tying off the strap with a vicious tug. It was not his concern. He had his own world to manage, his own ghost to keep at bay. He climbed back onto the wagon seat, the sun hot on the back of his neck. But he did not immediately urge Alice forward. He found himself watching her still. The small crowd dispersed. The train gave a final, great sigh of steam and began to pull away, its wheels grinding a mournful rhythm that seemed to echo the desolation on her face. She was left standing utterly alone on the platform, a single, abandoned trunk at her feet, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent expanse of the Wyoming sky. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of honey-blonde hair across her cheek, and sending a swirl of dust around the hem of her dark blue skirt. Eleonora felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "There must be some mistake," she had insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Alistair Sterling. He owns the Mercantile." Mr. Abernathy had removed his hat, his kind, weathered face etched with regret. "Ma'am, I've been the station master here for 10 years. The Mercantile is owned by Jedediah Croft, and before him, his father. There's never been a Mr. Sterling in Redemption Creek. Not that I've ever heard of." He had looked at the letter she held out, at the elegant looping script, and then back at her. "I'm sorry, miss. Truly sorry. It seems you've been misinformed. Deceived." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The entire foundation of her new life had just crumbled into dust. She was alone, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known, with dwindling funds and a trunk full of clothes useless for this harsh land. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She took a half-step back, her heel catching on an uneven plank. Caleb saw her stumble. Before he could think, before his ingrained habit of non-involvement could assert itself, he was moving. He swung down from the wagon, his long strides eating up the distance between them in a few seconds. He reached her just as she lost her balance completely. His hands closed around her upper arms, his grip firm and steadying, preventing her fall. The contact was a shock to them both. For Eleonora, the solid, warm strength of his hands through the fabric of her jacket was the first solid thing she had felt since stepping off the train. She looked up, startled, into a pair of the clearest, grayest eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of a winter sky, wary and guarded, and they were looking at her with an expression of profound reluctance. For Caleb, the feel of her was a jolt to his system. She was slender and delicate in his grasp, yet he could feel a tremor of strength running through her. She smelled faintly of lavender, a scent so out of place here it was like a memory from another life. It had been Sarah's scent. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and his hands tightened for a fraction of a second before he consciously forced them to relax. He had not willingly touched another person in 5 years. The intimacy of the simple act, born of instinct, felt like a betrayal of his carefully constructed solitude. He immediately let her go, stepping back as if burned. "You should be careful," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "The platform is uneven." Eleonora straightened her jacket, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," he supplied, his tone clipped. He gestured vaguely with his chin toward the station house. "Abernathy tell you there's no one here for you?" It was not a question so much as a statement of fact. He had already seen the answer. She swallowed, the knot of fear in her throat making it difficult to speak. "He did. It seems I've been the victim of a cruel deception." She said the words with a composure that surprised even herself, a remnant of her Boston breeding that insisted on dignity even in the face of disaster. Caleb gave a short, hard nod. He had seen it before. Hopeful women lured west by lies, left stranded and helpless. It was a bitter, ugly business. His first instinct was to turn and walk away, to get back in his wagon and leave her to the town's dubious charity. She was not his problem. He had enough burdens of his own to carry. But he looked at her face, at the determined set of her jaw fighting against the despair in her eyes, and he saw not a fragile doll, but a woman trying desperately not to break. The unwelcome flicker of sympathy returned, stronger this time. The sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. Soon it would be dark, and the prairie night was cold and filled with dangers, both animal and human. He could not just leave her here. The code of conduct he lived by, a silent, personal creed of honor, would not permit it. He let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound resignation. It was the sound of a fortress wall developing its first crack. "You have a place to stay tonight?" Her chin lifted a fraction. "I will make inquiries at the hotel, if there's one." Caleb's gaze flickered to the saloon, where a pair of drunk and leering cowboys had just stumbled out onto the boardwalk. The town's only boarding house was a ramshackle affair above that very saloon, a place no decent woman should set foot in. His expression hardened. "That's not a place for you." He wrestled with himself for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the scent of dust and the coming night. His solitude called to him, a safe and silent harbor. But the sight of her, so utterly alone, was a storm he could not ignore. "I have a ranch," he said finally, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "It's a few hours from here. My housekeeper, Martha, is there. You can have a room. Until you decide what to do." He made the offer gruffly, as if it were a business transaction, devoid of any charity. He needed her to understand this was temporary, a practical solution to a practical problem, nothing more. He was not offering help. He was offering shelter. There was a difference. Eleonora stared at him, taken aback. This stranger, this hard-faced man with eyes like a winter storm, was offering her refuge. Distrust warred with desperation. In Boston, one did not simply accept such an offer from a man one had just met. But this was not Boston. Here, the rules were different, written not in books of etiquette, but in the harsh reality of survival. She looked from his stoic face to the darkening street, heard a burst of loud, coarse laughter from the saloon, and made her choice. "You are very kind, Mr. Thorne." "I'm not kind," he corrected her, his voice flat. "I'm practical." He turned without another word and hefted her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing, swinging it up into the bed of his wagon. "Come on. It'll be full dark soon." The journey to the ranch was made in a silence broken only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the steady creak of the wagon wheels. Eleonora sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her. He seemed to take up more than a share of the space, a presence as solid and unyielding as the landscape unfolding around them. As the last vestiges of Redemption Creek fell away behind them, she felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had been cast adrift from the known world. The prairie stretched out in every direction, a vast, rolling sea of darkening grass under a sky so immense it was humbling. The colors deepened from fiery orange to soft violet and finally to a deep, star-dusted indigo. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail, but he was aware of her every nervous shift, every quiet intake of breath. Having her beside him felt unnatural, an intrusion into the sacred space of his solitude. The faint scent of lavender persisted, a ghost in the clean, sage-scented air. It stirred memories he had worked for years to bury, images of smiling face and a warm hand in his. He gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles white. This was a mistake. He should have given her a few dollars and left her to the sheriff's care. But he hadn't. And now she was here, a fragile piece of another world sitting beside him in the gathering dark, and he was responsible for her. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any sack of flour. They arrived at the ranch well after nightfall. In the moonlight, Eleonora could make out the dark, solid shapes of a modest cabin, a large barn, and several corrals. A light glowed warmly in the cabin window, a welcoming beacon in the immense darkness. As Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of yellow light onto the hard-packed earth. A stout, gray-haired woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. "Caleb, that you?" Her voice called out, warm and practical. "It's me, Martha," he answered, swinging down from the wagon. He turned to Eleonora. "This is Martha. She runs this place." And me, most days, it was the closest he had come to a pleasantry, and it felt awkward on his tongue. Martha's sharp eyes took in the sight of the strange, finely dressed woman on the wagon seat, and then flickered to Caleb's grim face. She was a woman who had seen much in her 60 years, and had learned not to be surprised by anything. She simply nodded, her expression softening as she saw the exhaustion and fear in Eleanor's eyes. "Well, get down, child, before you freeze to the seat. Supper's hot on the stove." Inside, the cabin was simple but immaculately clean. It consisted of one large room that served as a kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and filling the room with the scent of pine smoke and roasting meat. It was a haven of warmth and safety against the vast, cold night. Eleonora felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease for the first time in days. Over a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Eleonora found herself explaining her situation to Martha, whose gentle, probing questions were far more effective than Caleb's stoic silence had been. Caleb sat at the head of the table, eating methodically, contributing little to the conversation, but listening to every word. He watched the play of firelight on Eleonora's face, the way her voice trembled when she spoke of her dashed hopes, and the stubborn pride that kept her from shedding a single tear. He had expected hysterics, weakness. He saw instead a quiet, steely strength that he had not anticipated. It was admirable. The thought was as unsettling as her presence. After the meal, Martha showed Eleonora to a small, private room at the back of the cabin. It was Spartan, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand, and a single chair, but it was clean and welcoming. It was Caleb's mother's room, Martha said softly. Hasn't been used in years. You'll be safe here, dear. You rest now. Left alone, Eleonora sank onto the edge of the bed, the exhaustion of the long day finally washing over her. The mattress was firm, stuffed with straw, but it felt like a cloud. She looked around the small, plain room, a space that held the ghosts of another woman's life, and felt a profound and aching loneliness. She was a stranger in a strange land, her future a terrifying, formless void. And yet, for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She had been met not with cruelty or indifference, but with a gruff, reluctant kindness. It was a tiny seed of hope planted in the barren soil of her despair. In the days that followed, a quiet routine established itself. Eleonora, unwilling to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha. She learned to knead bread, to mend worn denim trousers with small, neat stitches, to pluck a chicken, and to tend the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. The work was hard, unfamiliar, and it left her hands chapped and her muscles aching, but it was honest. Each completed task was a small victory, a piece of a new identity she was building for herself out of the wreckage of the old one. She was no longer just Miss Vance of Boston. She was a woman who could feed herself, who could contribute, who could survive. Caleb watched her from a distance. He saw her grim determination as she learned to use a hoe, the way she spoke softly to the chickens as she scattered their feed, the quiet dignity she maintained even when covered in flour. He had expected her to be a delicate thing, a hothouse flower that would wilt under the harsh Wyoming sun. But she was not wilting. She was adapting, her roots finding purchase in the rocky soil of this new life. He found himself comparing her to Sarah, his late wife. Sarah had been born to this land, a part of it, as sturdy and resilient as a prairie wildflower. Eleonora was different. She was a garden rose, transplanted into the wilderness, and her struggle to survive was a thing of fierce and fragile beauty. He continued to keep his distance, his conversations with her brief and practical, limited to necessities. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, immersing himself in the endless, back-breaking work of the ranch. The physical labor was a balm, a way to quiet the thoughts that churned in his mind. But he was always aware of her. He would catch her scent, lavender and wood smoke, lingering in the cabin when he came in for a late supper. He would see the book she had left on the mantelpiece, its pages filled with poetry he could not understand. She was a quiet, constant presence that was slowly but surely seeping through the cracks in his fortress walls. One evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, a magnificent and terrifying display of nature's power. Rain lashed against the cabin, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small log house. They were trapped inside together, the storm enforcing a proximity that Caleb had been trying to avoid. Martha sat in her rocking chair, knitting placidly, seemingly immune to the tempest outside. Eleonora sat at the table, a book open but unread in front of her, her gaze fixed on the fire. Caleb stood by the window, watching the lightning illuminate the drenched landscape in brief, stark flashes. The enclosed space felt charged, the air thick with unspoken words. He could feel her watching him. "Does it frighten you?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible above the roar of the wind. He turned from the window. "The storm? No, it's just weather. It'll pass." "I wasn't speaking of the storm," she said, her gaze steady. "I was speaking of this. The silence. The solitude. You seem so at home in it. I don't think I could ever get used to it." The question was a direct challenge to the very core of his existence. He felt a familiar defensiveness rise in him. "A man gets used to what he has to," he said, his tone clipped. "It's safer this way. Rely on yourself. You're never disappointed." "Is that what you believe?" she pressed gently. "That it is better to be safe than to be happy?" Her words struck a nerve, a raw and painful one. Happy. The word was a foreign country he had been exiled from long ago. He looked at her, at the earnest curiosity in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt the urge to explain, to make her understand the bleak landscape of his heart. Martha had discreetly risen and gone to her room, leaving them alone in the flickering firelight. "I had a wife," he said, the words tasting of ash. He had not spoken her name to another soul in 5 years. "Her name was Sarah. We had a son, Daniel." He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his gray eyes, showing him scenes he had tried 1,000 times to forget. There was a fever that winter. It took them both, in the space of a week. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than the storm outside. He had laid the broken pieces of his past on the hearth between them, a raw and unguarded admission. He expected pity, or perhaps awkward condolences. Instead, Eleanor's voice was filled with a quiet, aching empathy. "I'm so sorry, Caleb." She did not say more, did not offer empty platitudes. She simply sat with him in his grief. After a moment, she spoke again, her own voice thick with memory. "My parents died 2 years ago. The influenza. One day, my world was full of life and laughter. The next, it was just silent. I know that silence." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile Eastern lady, but a fellow survivor. They were two people from different worlds, bound by the common, brutal language of loss. In that shared vulnerability, a fragile bridge was built between them, spanning the chasm of his solitude. He saw the strength in her, a resilience that mirrored his own, and for the first time, he did not feel entirely alone in his fortress. He had let someone in, just a crack, and the light that filtered through was both terrifying and strangely warm. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. The next morning, the world seemed new, the colors of the prairie more vibrant, the sky a brighter, clearer blue. Something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that changed the very atmosphere of the small cabin. The silence was no longer tense and guarded, but comfortable, companionable. Caleb found himself lingering over his morning coffee instead of immediately heading out to the barn. He watched as Eleanora braided her long, honey-blonde hair, her movements swift and sure. He noticed the small details, the way a stray curl escaped to brush her temple, the determined set of her mouth as she concentrated on a task. Eleanora, in turn, felt a subtle change in him. The hardness in his eyes had softened, just a fraction, and his terse sentences sometimes stretched into actual conversation. He asked her about Boston, about the books she read, his questions betraying a curiosity he had kept carefully hidden. She told him about the crowded streets, the libraries, the concerts, painting a picture of a world so different from his own. He listened intently, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to imagine a place with more people than trees. Their shared respect grew with each passing day. He saw her courage, not just in facing her uncertain future, but in the small, daily acts of adapting to a life for which she was completely unprepared. She never complained about the hard work, the lack of amenities, or the profound isolation. Instead, she faced each challenge with a quiet grace that he found himself admiring more and more. She, in turn, saw the kindness and honor beneath his gruff exterior. She saw it in the way he treated his horse, the gentle way he spoke to Martha, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes when he looked out over the land that was his life's work. He was a good man, a man wounded by life but not broken by it. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. The world that Eleonora had fled, the world of deception and greed, had not forgotten her. They had the look of hired men, the kind that worked for men with more money than scruples. A cold knot formed in Caleb's stomach. He immediately thought of Eleonora and the story of her deception. What did they want with her? Didn't say, but they were asking around the saloon, flashing coin. Described her perfectly. When old Jedediah Croft came in, they clammed up right quick and bought him a drink. The three of them were thick as thieves in a corner for the better part of an hour. Silas Croft. The name landed like a stone. Croft was the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a ruthless man who had built an empire by swallowing up smaller homesteads, using intimidation, legal trickery, and outright violence to get what he wanted. He owned the mercantile, the saloon, half the town, and had been trying for years to buy Caleb's land. Caleb's ranch was smaller than Croft's sprawling operation, but it had something Croft desperately needed: sole, unimpeded access to the Sweetwater River, the most reliable water source for 100 miles. Caleb had always refused to sell. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The elaborate deception, the non-existent Mr. Sterling, the lure of a new life. It hadn't been a simple swindle for her small inheritance. It was a scheme by Silas Croft. He had intended to plant a woman on Caleb's ranch, someone who could perhaps gain his trust, find his deed, or manufacture some kind of claim to the land. And when the plan had gone wrong, when Eleonora had ended up under Caleb's protection instead of acting as his betrayer, Croft had gotten impatient. "You tell those men anything?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Told them there was no woman at your place," Brody said. "Told them to move on. They rode out this morning, heading south. But my gut tells me they'll be back. You watch yourself, Caleb, and you watch over that young lady. A man like Croft doesn't give up easy." The ride back to the ranch was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. The fragile peace he had begun to feel was shattered, replaced by a cold, familiar fury. He was furious at Croft for his boundless greed, furious at the men who had deceived Eleonora, and furious at himself for allowing her to become entangled in his own long-standing conflict. She had come west seeking a safe harbor and had instead sailed directly into a war. His war. When he reached the ranch, he saw her near the creek that bordered his property, gathering wildflowers. She had taken off her shoes and was wading in the shallow, clear water, her skirt hitched up to her knees. The late afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. She looked up as he approached and gave him a smile, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her face. For a moment, she looked completely at peace, a part of the landscape. The sight of her, so innocent and unaware of the closing danger, filled him with a fierce, terrifying protectiveness that stole his breath. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience in 5 years, and its return was as painful as it was powerful. He did not return her smile. He dismounted, his face a grim mask. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "I was just gathering flowers for the table. I wasn't far from the house." "This isn't a Boston park, Eleonora," he snapped. "There are dangers here you can't even imagine." He wanted to tell her everything, to explain about Croft and the men asking questions in town. But he couldn't. The words caught in his throat. To tell her would be to admit how completely his world and his problems had enveloped her. It would be to acknowledge the responsibility he now felt for her, a responsibility that went far beyond providing simple shelter. His anger and fear came out as cold distance. Over the next few days, he became more remote than ever, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. He took to carrying his rifle with him everywhere, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He forbade her from leaving the immediate vicinity of the cabin, his orders curt and unexplained. Eleonora was hurt and bewildered by the sudden change. The tentative connection they had forged seemed to have vanished, replaced by the old, familiar distance. She felt like a prisoner, her world shrinking to the four walls of the cabin and the small patch of garden out back. She did not understand that his coldness was a shield, a desperate attempt to protect her from a threat she did not even know existed. The first direct message from Croft came a week later. Caleb awoke before dawn to the sound of distressed cattle. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in seconds. In the pale, pre-dawn light, he saw that a section of his northern fence had been cut. A dozen of his best steers had been driven out onto the open range, scattered to the winds. It would take him days to round them all up. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, a warning shot. They had been on his land, close to his home, while he and the women slept. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He spent the next 2 days in the saddle, tracking down the scattered cattle. He rode with a constant, gnawing anxiety, his thoughts never straying far from the cabin and the woman inside it. He felt torn in two, needing to be in 2 places at once. When he finally returned, exhausted and grim-faced, he found Eleonora on the porch, waiting for him. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Martha was worried. "Fence was cut," he said, swinging down from Atlas. "Lost some cattle. I got them back." He started to walk past her toward the barn. "Let me help you," she said, stepping in front of him. "With your horse." I can brush him down." "I don't need your help," he said, his voice flat. He pushed past her, his shoulder brushing hers. The brief contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of the connection he was trying so desperately to deny. Pushing her away felt like pushing away a part of himself. Later that evening, he saw the consequences of his harshness. He found her by the creek again, not gathering flowers this time, but sitting on a large, flat rock, her head in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. The sight broke through his carefully constructed armor. He had been trying to protect her, but all he had succeeded in doing was hurting her. He walked toward her slowly, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. She didn't hear him until he was standing right behind her. She looked up, startled, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide and wounded. "What have I done, Caleb?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why are you so angry with me? If I am such a burden, I will leave. I will find work in town. I will not impose on you any longer." "It's not you," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. He sat down on a rock beside her, the first time he had willingly closed the distance between them. "You're not a burden." He took a deep breath, the clean, cool air doing little to calm the turmoil inside him. He had to tell her. He had to make her understand. He told her everything. He told her about Silas Croft and his desire for the ranch's water rights. He told her about the men in town and his suspicion that her arrival was part of Croft's scheme. He told her about the cut fence and the scattered cattle. As he spoke, he watched her face change from confusion and hurt to a dawning, horrified understanding. "So, he brought me here to use me against you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My entire journey, it was all a lie designed to harm you." The thought seemed to sicken her. "It's not your fault, Eleonora," he said, his voice softer now. "You were a pawn in his game, the same as me." She looked out over the whispering water, a new resolve hardening her expression. "He will not win," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This man who preys on the hopes of others. He will not drive you from your home, and he will not use me to do it." In that moment, he saw the full measure of her strength. She was not afraid. She was angry. She was a fighter, and she had, without realizing it, just declared herself his ally. She had chosen her side. The unspoken truce settled into something deeper, a partnership forged in the face of a common enemy. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of their days, but it was no longer a wedge driving them apart. Instead, it bound them together. Caleb began teaching her to shoot, taking her out to a secluded part of the valley and setting up tin cans on a fence post. Her hands were steady, her eyes surprisingly true. He stood behind her, his hands covering hers to show her how to hold the heavy rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder. The physical contact was electric, a current of awareness that ran between them, charged with all the things they could not say. Her hair smelled of sunshine and lavender, and he had to consciously force himself to focus on the lesson, his voice coming out gruffer than he intended. One afternoon, Eleonora decided to take a walk, staying within the boundaries Caleb had set for her, the rifle he had given her held firmly in her hands. She followed the creek upstream, the sound of the gurgling water a soothing companion. The air was warm, and the valley was peaceful, making the threat of Silas Croft seem distant and unreal. She allowed herself to relax, just for a moment, setting the rifle down to pick a cluster of wild bluebells growing near the water's edge. It was a mistake. They came out of the trees, so silently she didn't hear them until they were almost upon her. There were two of them, the same men Sheriff Brody had described. They were large, unkempt, and had the dead-eyed look of men who were paid to do ugly things. "Well, look what we have here," the first one said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "The pretty little bird from the east. Mr. Croft is very eager to make your acquaintance." Eleanor's heart leaped in her throat. She scrambled for the rifle, but the second man was faster, his boot pinning it to the ground. She was trapped. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "No need to be scared, little lady," the first one sneered, advancing on her. "We're just going to take you for a little ride, a little talk with our employer." Fear gave way to a surge of pure, cold fury. She would not be a victim. She would not be used. She fainted to her left, and as the man reached for her, she spun and threw a handful of dirt and pebbles from the creek bank directly into his face. He howled in pain and surprise, clawing at his eyes. The second man lunged for her, but she was already moving, scrambling up the rocky embankment, her hands and knees scraping against the sharp stones. She didn't get far. A hand tangled in her skirt, yanking her backward. She fell hard, the air knocked from her lungs. The man loomed over her, his face a mask of rage. "You're going to regret that, you little—" He never finished the sentence. A sound like the crack of a whip echoed through the valley, and the man's hat flew from his head, a neat hole punched through the crown. He froze, his eyes wide with shock. Both men spun around to see Caleb standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle leveled, his face a thunderous mask of cold, deadly rage. He had been watching from a ridge, a habit born of his new, constant vigilance, and had seen the men emerge from the trees. "Get away from her." Caleb's voice was unnaturally calm, a low growl that promised swift and terrible violence. The first man, his eyes still watering, reached for the pistol at his hip. It was a fatal error. Caleb fired again, the shot so fast it was a blur of motion and sound. The man's gun flew from his hand, his fingers mangled and bloody. He screamed, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. "The next one goes through your skull," Caleb said, his voice unchanged. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, the rifle never wavering. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a predator, protecting his territory, and his eyes promised death. "Get on your horses. Ride back to Croft. You tell him that if he or any of his men ever set foot on this land again, I will bury them where they stand. You tell him this is his only warning." The two men, one bleeding and the other pale with terror, scrambled for their horses. They mounted up and fled, galloping away as if the devil himself were on their heels. The clearing was suddenly, profoundly silent. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the creek and Eleanor's ragged breathing. Caleb's eyes never left the retreating figures until they had disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower the rifle. He turned to her, his face still hard, but the cold fury in his eyes was replaced by a raw, naked fear. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. His hands hovered over her, wanting to touch, to reassure himself she was real and unharmed, but not daring to. "No," she whispered, though she was shaking uncontrollably. "I'm not hurt." You saved me." He reached out then, his callous thumb gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. "I told you not to come out here alone," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a deep, aching anguish. He was looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, something he had almost lost. In that moment, everything fell away, the danger, the fear, the vast differences between their worlds. All that was left was the undeniable truth that was reflected in his stormy gray eyes. He pulled her to her feet, his hands firm on her arms, and drew her into an embrace, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her cheek. He held her for a long time, his body shielding hers, as if he could protect her from all the dangers of the world through sheer force of will. This was no longer about practicality or responsibility. This was something else entirely, something deeper and far more terrifying to them both. The rescue changed everything. The raw fear Caleb had felt at the thought of losing her had shaken him to his very foundation. It had exposed the truth he had been fighting for weeks. His fortress of solitude had been breached, and his heart was no longer his own. The revelation terrified him. Love was a weakness. It was a pain he had sworn never to feel again. The memory of Sarah and Daniel was a constant, aching wound, and the thought of suffering such a loss a second time was unbearable. He retreated back behind his walls, but this time they were built of a colder, harder stone. He began to believe that the only way to truly protect Eleonora was to send her away, far from him, far from Silas Croft, far from this violent land that had almost claimed her. His love for her, a thing he could barely admit to himself, manifested as a cruel, desperate necessity to push her away. He became cold, distant, his words clipped and his gaze remote. He avoided her in the cabin, taking his meals alone on the porch, his back to the door. He no longer spoke of Boston or her books. He no longer met her eyes across the dinner table. The warm companionship that had bloomed between them withered in the frost of his sudden withdrawal. Eleonora was heartbroken. She could not understand his transformation. After the intimacy of that desperate embrace by the creek, after the raw emotion she had seen in his eyes, this cold rejection was a form of cruelty she could not comprehend. She believed she had misread everything. She thought that, in a moment of crisis, he had acted on instinct, and now, in the cold light of day, he regretted it. She was, once again, just a burden to him, a problem he had to solve. The pain of it was a sharp, physical ache in her chest. Finally, after 3 days of this agonizing silence, he cornered her in the main room as she was folding laundry. He stood blocking the doorway, his face set like granite. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Yes," she replied, her own voice quiet but firm. "I believe we do. The stage leaves for Cheyenne in 2 days." He began, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over her head. "From there, you can get a train back east. I'll give you the money for your passage. Enough to get you started again when you get back to Boston." The words hit her like a slap. He was sending her away, dismissing her. He was casting her out of his life as easily as one might discard a worn-out tool. All her fears, all her insecurities, rushed back in a suffocating wave. Safer in your solitude, without anyone to trouble your precious peace. Her words struck home, a direct hit on the truth he was trying to hide even from himself. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "My life is not your concern. I'm doing this for your own good." "Do not presume to know what is for my own good," she cried, her composure finally breaking. "You think I am some fragile doll that will shatter at the first sign of trouble? I have faced trouble all my life. I lost my family, I was deceived and abandoned, and I have found myself here, in this place you say I do not belong. And I have not shattered yet. I thought I had finally found a place where I was respected, valued. I was wrong." Tears streamed down her face, hot and bitter. She threw the folded shirt onto the table. "Fina, I will leave. I will be out of your way. But do not insult me by pretending you are doing this for me. "You are doing this for yourself." She pushed past him, fleeing to the sanctuary of her small room, the sound of a closing door echoing in the cabin like a final, definitive gunshot. Caleb stood frozen, her words ringing in his ears. He had achieved his goal. She had agreed to leave. He had successfully pushed her away. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt a hollow, aching emptiness that was worse than any grief he had ever known. He had saved her from Croft only to break her heart himself. The next 36 hours were a misery of strained silence and averted gazes. Martha, seeing the situation with her wise, sad eyes, tried to intervene, but Caleb cut her off with a sharp word, and Eleonora simply shook her head, her face pale and drawn. She packed her trunk, her movements slow and deliberate, each folded dress a farewell to the life she had briefly, foolishly, allowed herself to imagine. The night before she was to leave, a heavy, oppressive stillness settled over the ranch. There was no moon, no stars, only a thick blanket of cloud that smothered the land in an inky blackness. Caleb sat on the porch, a bottle of whiskey untouched beside him, his rifle across his lap. He was keeping watch, telling himself it was for her safety on this final night, but he knew he was really standing guard over the ruins of his own heart. The attack came without warning. It was not a subtle raid, but a full-blown assault. A flaming arrow thudded into the dry wood of the barn roof, which erupted in a terrifying whoosh of fire. At the same moment, the windows of the cabin shattered inwards, and the roar of shotguns echoed through the night. Silas Croft had grown tired of waiting. He had come to take the ranch by force, to burn it to the ground and kill anyone who stood in his way. Caleb reacted on pure instinct. "Martha! Eleonora! Get down!" he roared, kicking over the heavy dining table to create a makeshift barricade. He fired his rifle through the broken window, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. A cry of pain answered from the darkness outside. Martha, her face grim, grabbed an old pistol from a drawer and began loading it with steady hands. But Eleonora did not cower. Her fear was a cold, hard thing in her stomach, but her heartbreak had burned away her passivity. If this was to be her end, she would not meet it hiding in a corner. She saw a dark shape moving through the shattered front window, a man with a wild beard and a gleaming knife. Caleb was occupied, firing at another target near the barn. There was no time to scream, no time to think. She seized the one weapon available to her, the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. With a cry that was part fury and part terror, she swung it with all her might. The poker connected with the side of the intruder's head with a sickening crunch. He grunted, staggering back, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing in a heap on the floor. Caleb spun around at the sound, his rifle ready. He saw the downed man and Eleonora standing over him, the poker gripped in her white-knuckled hands, her chest heaving. Her eyes met his across the smoky, chaotic room, and in them he saw not a terrified victim, but a fierce, determined warrior. The sight of her, so brave and so utterly magnificent, struck him with the force of a physical blow. What had he been thinking, trying to send her away? She did not belong in Boston. She belonged here, with him. The firefight raged. The barn was now a blazing inferno, casting a hellish, dancing light over the entire ranch. Gunshots flashed in the darkness. Through it all, Eleonora became his partner. When his rifle ran empty, she was there, pushing cartridges into his hand. She reloaded the spare pistol, her movements becoming more sure, more certain with each passing second. They moved together in a grim, unspoken rhythm, a united front against the chaos that sought to destroy them. Finally, the assault began to wane. The attackers, having lost the element of surprise and facing a far fiercer defense than they had anticipated, began to fall back. The sounds of their retreat, hoofbeats fading into the night, were followed by an eerie, ringing silence, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn. The immediate danger was over. The cabin was a wreck of shattered glass and splintered wood, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Martha was checking on the unconscious man on the floor. Caleb stood in the middle of it all, his rifle hanging loosely in his hand, his eyes fixed on Eleonora. She was leaning against the wall, her face smudged with soot, a deep scratch on her cheek. She looked exhausted, terrified, and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. The thought of what he had almost done, of what he had almost lost, crashed over him in a tidal wave of regret and clarity. His fear of losing her was nothing compared to the agony of willingly sending her away. His solitude was not a fortress, it was a prison, and she was the one who held the key. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his boots crunching on broken glass. He stopped in front of her, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped away the soot from her cheeks. "I was a fool," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. The walls around his heart did not just crack, they crumbled into dust. The biggest fool in this entire territory. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, searched his. "Caleb, don't go," he said, his voice breaking. "Please don't go. Everything I said, I was wrong. I was trying to protect you, but I was just protecting myself from this." He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closing. "From feeling this. I love you, Eleonora. I think I have from the moment I saw you standing on that train platform. Loving you is the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. But the thought of you leaving, that's 100 times worse. My life was empty before you came. Don't make me go back to that. Stay and build a life with me." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. She raised her hands to cover his, holding them against her face. "I love you too, Caleb Thorne," she whispered through her tears. "I have nowhere else to go. This is my home now." He let out a ragged breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. In the midst of the wreckage of his home, surrounded by the evidence of a violent battle, he had finally found his peace. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not gentle or tentative, but fierce and desperate and full of promises. It was a kiss that sealed their future, a declaration that from the ashes of this night, they would rise together. As dawn broke, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of soft gray and pink, the sound of approaching riders sent a fresh jolt of alarm through them. But it was not Croft's men returning. It was Sheriff Brody and a posse of 6 townsmen, their faces grim. One of the fleeing attackers, it turned out, had ridden straight to town to get his wounded hand treated and had been promptly arrested after a few too many whiskeys and a lot of loose talk. The sheriff took in the scene. The smoldering ruins of the barn, the bullet-riddled cabin, the trussed-up thug on the floor, and let out a low whistle. "Looks like you had a busy night, Caleb." He looked from Caleb to Eleonora, noting the way they stood so close together, a united front. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "We got Croft. He was waiting at the edge of his property like a vulture. Didn't even put up a fight when we told him we had his man, singing like a canary. He'll be on his way to the territorial prison by week's end." The external threat was gone, neutralized as suddenly as it had appeared. The long shadow of Silas Croft that had hung over the valley had vanished with the morning mist. In the quiet aftermath, as the townsmen helped douse the last of the embers from the barn, a new, brighter reality began to set in. Caleb took Eleonora's hand, his grip warm and sure, and led her away from the wreckage, toward the creek. The water flowed on, indifferent to the night's violence, its surface sparkling in the new day's light. The air was clean here, smelling of wet stone and wild mint. "Last night," Caleb began, his voice still rough with the emotion of his confession. "When I saw you, when I thought I might lose you, I realized something. This land, this ranch, I always thought it was everything. My life's work, but it's just dirt and wood. It's nothing without someone to share it with. It's a place, not a home." He stopped and turned to face her, his gray eyes serious and full of a light she had never seen there before. "I don't want to just build a life with you, Eleonora. I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night." I want to fill that cabin with children and laughter. I want to erase all the silence. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. He opened it to reveal a simple, slender gold band, its surface worn smooth with time. "This was my grandmother's," he said softly. "She came here in a covered wagon, built a life out of nothing but grit and hope. She was the strongest woman I ever knew. Until I met you." He knelt then, on the damp earth by the side of the creek, holding the ring up to her. His large, calloused hand trembled slightly. "Eleanora Vance, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy streamed down her face, washing away the last of the soot and sorrow. She couldn't speak, so she just nodded, a frantic, happy motion. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She was home. She had finally, truly come home. Their wedding was a simple affair held 2 weeks later, right there on the ranch. The townsfolk, who had once whispered about the strange Eastern woman staying with the reclusive Caleb Thorne, now rallied around them. They had heard the story of the attack, of her bravery, and had welcomed her as one of their own. The men helped Caleb raise the frame for a new, larger barn. The women brought food and gifts, their initial suspicion replaced by a warm, communal acceptance. Eleanora stood beside Caleb on the porch of the repaired cabin, the same porch where he had once sat in lonely vigil. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her sew, and in her hair were the wild bluebells she loved. Mr. Abernathy, the station master who had been the first to show her kindness, read the vows. Sheriff Brody stood as Caleb's witness, and Martha, weeping openly with happiness, stood as hers. As they spoke their promises to each other, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees, and the sun shone down, warm and benevolent. They were no longer two solitary people defined by their losses, but a union, a new beginning, their future as wide and promising as the Wyoming sky above them. 2 years later, the late summer sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The Thorne Ranch was thriving. The new barn stood tall and proud, its fresh pine smelling sweet in the warm air. The cabin had a new wing, with wide windows that let in the afternoon light. In front of it, a garden overflowed with color, scarlet runners, yellow squash blossoms, and rows of the bluebells Eleanora had so carefully transplanted from the creek bank. The scars of that violent night had been erased, replaced by the signs of life, growth, and prosperity. Caleb sat on the expanded porch in a sturdy rocking chair he had built himself. He was not alone. In his arms, he held their 1-year-old son, Daniel, named for the brother he would never know, but whose memory was now a gentle warmth rather than a sharp pain. The boy had his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's serious gray eyes, which were currently fixed in rapt attention on a butterfly dancing over the garden. The screen door creaked open and Eleanora emerged, carrying 2 glasses of cool lemonade. She was radiant, her face glowing with health and happiness. She was pregnant again, her condition a soft, gentle curve beneath her simple cotton dress. She handed a glass to Caleb and sat in the rocker beside him, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of shared love and understanding. The only sounds were the buzz of insects in the garden, the soft coo of their son, and the gentle creak of the rocking chairs on the porch planks. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Eleanora asked softly, her gaze on the distant purple mountains. "That first night, during the storm, you said you believed it was better to be safe than to be happy." Caleb looked down at the child in his arms, and then at his wife, her profile serene and beautiful against the setting sun. He felt a wave of love so powerful it was a physical presence, a warmth that filled every corner of the emptiness he had once carried inside him. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but certain. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. "I thought this land was all I ever needed, a place to hide away." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The land is the place," she said, her voice a soft echo of a truth they had both discovered. But this is the home. He turned his head and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss filled with the peace and contentment of a man who had finally found everything he had never known he was searching for. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky, silent witnesses to a love that had taken root and blossomed in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness.